I call Charles Chabelle.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the Labour opposition will be supporting this legislation as it comes back to the House from the Law and Order Committee. And I'd like to begin by commending the Minister for the appropriate gesture in referring to the fact that this largely consists of measures that were carried over from work that was underway prior to the change of government at the end of 2008. And while, of course, I won't bring the Speaker into the debate, it is appropriate, sir, to acknowledge your role as the responsible Minister in charge of the measures that were essentially brought forward for approval in the Cabinet so that the legislation was as ready as it is to have been progressed when it was introduced by the current Minister. So, obviously, the first reason for supporting the legislation on this side of the House is that it had its genesis in the days of the previous government. The previous government thought that the driver licence stop orders proposal, from memory back in July 2008, had real merit. There is real evidence from overseas, particularly in the Australian states, that these orders have had an effect, that they have reduced the scofflaw factor, for want of putting it more elegantly, and so it is appropriate to trial them here as the legislation would do. And when one looks at the figures, it's obvious that there is a need for some action in this area. Between July 2008 and June 2009, according to statistics from the Ministry of Justice, the courts wiped $95.1 million out of the total $806 million owing by offenders and unpaid fines. So you've got more than 10% not being collected by the state in terms of properly levied penalties. And worse than that, you've got an increasing trend as far as those increasing penalties are concerned. So clearly there is some need for a greater power than that which exists in the current law. And it is appropriate, I think, to address the problem of overdue fines for another reason, and that is the dissatisfaction of the victims of crime. Often offenders owing sums by court order will, in respect of those sums, effectively be reimbursing victims through reparation orders. And it is very frustrating for creditors and debtors actually using the court's civil debt enforcement process, because that's what they have to fall back on in the event of any better remedy. So I'd like to, as I say, repeat the Minister's acknowledgement of you, sir. I'd also like to acknowledge the Minister's making available of officials to brief the opposition when this bill was proposed as an omnibus amendment, and I think it was a useful practice to have followed. It certainly made it easier for the Labour Party to understand what the government's proposal was when it brought this legislation forward, and to be able to consent to its introduction and to support it at that stage. I think it is appropriate, though, to recall that there are a couple of missing proposals. I would have thought that maybe the Select Committee might have wanted to bring these proposals back on board, and no doubt we'll hear a long and learned discourse from Mrs Gowdy about why that wasn't able to be done on this occasion. Perhaps they will resurface in the supplementary order paper that the Minister foreshadowed but was unwilling or unable to give the House any detail about when she gave her second reading speech. But one of the most significant reforms that Labour wanted to put in place in this area was to have a single agency responsible for fines, rather than the 80-plus agencies. Well, there's a little snort of derision over there from the member for Coromandel, but why wouldn't Parliament? And it was a snort, but anyway, we won't go into that further. The party that trumpets rational government structure has passed up an opportunity to do some rationalisation on this basis. Why wouldn't you why wouldn't one take the opportunity to reduce those 80-plus issuing authorities to one, acting on behalf of all the others, so that it's responsible for the issuing and the collection of fines. That was a sensible proposal from the last government. It would have cut red tape, and it would have been a good thing for this Parliament to have put in place. But unfortunately, we've got a lost opportunity here, even with the Select Committee report back. And Sir, notwithstanding that that's a lost opportunity, as I've said before, this is a measure that generally we do support. I've mentioned the unpaid fine problem, the increasing unpaid fine problem. There's another reason why the legislation is important, and again it comes from the careful research that we've had from the Ministry of Justice. It shows that when people cross a certain threshold of money that they owe, and for young people that threshold can be as low as $2,000, then they just get to a point where they think, well, there's no point in trying to repay money. We might as well, we're in for $2,000, we're in the hole for that amount. Why bother trying to make any effort to make repayments beyond that figure? It's a bit like the John Maynard Keynes anecdote. If you owe the bank $100, you have a problem. But if you owe the bank $1 million, the bank has the problem. Well, that was the position that the state was getting into with this level of unpaid fine, over 10%, and this problem, particularly with younger offenders, just coming to the point where they felt at even as low as a level of $2,000 fines, it just wasn't worth putting in place a repayment plan. That was such a big figure for a lot of younger people that it was beyond their ken as far as trying to make repayment arrangement systems was concerned. Now, this bill goes some way to addressing that issue, but it's not entirely satisfactory in that area. But the fines register established by this bill is a good measure. Lending companies and the wider community will be made aware of people who owe money, and this will be another means by which there's pressure from the community to ensure that people do pay the fines that they owe the Crown. That's a good thing all around. So the other point that I wanted to make just before moving on to my final point concerning the Regulations Review Committee was to compare the process that the Minister adopted in this case to the process that's just been adopted by the Minister of Justice in respect of his latest package of criminal reforms. We had the announcement of those reforms yesterday at about 3 o'clock in a series of releases, and it's been a question since then of trying to look at the detail and respond to it. It's a package sold as the biggest and most significant reform to criminal procedure in 50 years, and yet when the opposition's been asked for its response, it's had to make that response on the basis of analysis on the hoof. What a much better approach it would have been for Simon Power to have adopted the approach that even though Ms Gowdy thinks all this consultation business is overblown, actually it results in good law if it's done properly. And hopefully this bill is going to be proof of that. He had the Minister making officials available to brief the opposition available to intelligently offer its support and to participate constructively in the Select Committee under her chairpersonship, so that we're back in the House being able to support the second reading. So the final point I want to make is to credit the Select Committee for taking on board a lot of the advice that it received from the Regulations Review Committee over particular provisions of the bill. In their original form, those provisions would have been offensive constitutionally. Some change has been proposed to those provisions. Certainly I commend those changes to the House. I wish they had gone further. I wish that all of the Regulations Review Committee's advice had been adopted, but there is at least some change proposed, and that is a good thing. So, sir, with those words, I do commend the bill on its second reading to the House.